You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Dara Albrecht, and I'm here with three wonderful guests to talk about zero-waste economies, circular packaging, and extended producer responsibility. Our first guest is Caroline DeLoach, who's a circular economy professional focused on helping the packaging industry create truly circular packaging solutions. She is the Director of Sustainability at Atlantic Packaging. Our next guest is Daniel Zlatnik. Daniel Zlatnik is an attorney at the CalRecycle program implementing the Plastic Pollution Prevention and Packaging Producer Responsibility Act. He also works with environmental marketing issues related to recyclability and compostability, sustainable packaging, extended producer responsibility, and the bans on single-use grocery store bags. Daniel's here speaking with us today in his personal capacity, not as a representative of CalRecycle or the state of California. And finally, we have Dacie Meng. Dacie is a policy expert at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, working on plastics policy and multilateral processes. She was previously the Director of Policy for North America at the Foundation and an attorney at Beverage and Diamond, where she worked on extended producer responsibility compliance. So thank you all for joining me on the podcast today.
It's great to be here.
Thanks, Tara. Great to be here.
Let's set the context a little bit for our listeners. Could y'all provide us with a brief overview of the current plastics market? How much plastic is being produced and sold around the world?
CalRecycle, in connection with its extended producer responsibility law, did a preliminary study of packaging and plastic that is disposed in the state. They estimated that 2.9 million tons of plastic single-use packaging, as well as single-use plastic food serviceware, are disposed of in California. And CalRecycle estimates that 171 billion pieces of plastic components, packaging, or food serviceware is disposed of in the state.
Some of the stats that always blow me away are that global production of plastic reached more than 450 million metric tons a year in 2018, which is projected to triple by 2050. And the largest use market for those plastics is packaging. In 2018, about 36% of all primary production of plastic was used for packaging.
And Caroline and Daniel, when we say packaging, what do we mean?
That's a great question. Just to clarify, the numbers I provided earlier were the baseline we're using for 2023 in California. So packaging, when we use it in the law, it's referring to what we call primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging. So primary is the actual thing physically holding a physical good. Secondary would be the box in which that comes in. And then tertiary packaging would be the thing holding multiple units of all that I just mentioned. And when we talk about packaging in California law, we're talking about all three of those. The difficulty comes in the concept of what is single-use packaging. It's not always clear. You might say a bottle of glue is primary packaging, but what if the glue is in a glue stick? Is that primary packaging, or is it just part of the product? So a lot of the fuzziness comes when you're talking about, is this packaging for a good, or is it just the good itself?
And Daniel, where does food serviceware fall into the definition? For SB 54, for example, I know we talk about packaging and food serviceware.
Just to clarify, for California law, we refer to the Extended Producer Responsibility Law as SB 54. In the law, it does focus on single-use packaging, but also plastic single-use food serviceware. California law tries to treat it all the same. It's all called covered material under the law. That itself causes some tension because they are fundamentally different. Packaging always is material containing another physical good. A box by itself is not packaging because it doesn't have a physical good, but food serviceware is food serviceware when it's manufactured. So that creates all sorts of problems identifying what's called covered material as two fundamentally different things. How do you identify who's responsible for one? Are the rules different for another? It's an important challenge we have in California.
Wow, I think when you all describe all these different categorizations and considerations, it really does boggle your mind just how much plastic there is out in the world. So thinking of just the sheer amount of packaging, plastic, all these materials we have, what actually happens to them after they're used?
It's common for people to cite statistics saying that less than 10% of plastics are recycled, and that is generally around what we think to be true. As of 2015, around 9% of plastic waste was recycled, 12% incinerated, and 79% was accumulated in landfills or the natural environment. We believe that packaging is the largest single category of waste in landfills, comprising about 28% of landfills' weight. The largest use market for plastics is packaging, and that packaging is the largest contributor to plastic waste, about 46% in 2018. One of the caveats that I always think is important to call out, though, is that when we say 9% of it is recycled, that doesn't mean necessarily that recycling is not worthwhile. Part of the problem with a lot of that plastic waste and a lot of the reason so much of it accumulates in landfills and in the environment is because it's not designed to be recycled. There's a big difference, for example, between a plastic bottle that held your soda, which is quite recyclable, both technically and in terms of the infrastructure to recycle it, compared to the plastic around a pair of sunglasses.
Caroline, you foreshadow something we're going to dive into later, and one might be excused for being doubtful that this can be solved. But it's true, some things just aren't designed to be recycled. And a lot of it is a policy challenge, not just a technical challenge. And I think the policy stuff is what we can talk about today and I think is surmountable. For example, we have products that would be recyclable, but for a particular sticker they have on it. Some stickers interfere with recycling, some don't. That's where policy can step in. Then there are other components of packaging that, while they might not be physically capable of being recycled and put into new products, are necessary to allow other material to be used that will be recycled. So those are things holding the system back that can be solved.
And I just want to pick up on one thing you said, Dara, which I think you said kind of this packaging after it's used versus at the end of life. And those are different in practice when we have packaging and we start thinking about what are the solutions to tackle this single-use packaging problem. In theory, single-use packaging can only be used once, but the hope would be that after a first use, packaging could potentially be reused. And so there's a whole segment between end of the first use and end of life that we should be exploring and thinking critically about before we land in the recycling bin.
So, with current plastic packaging practice and their disposal, are there any social impacts that come to the forefront as a result of the way we're handling packaging?
One thing that is always interesting to bring up about the plastic pollution crisis in a way that mirrors the climate crisis and many other environmental issues is that typically the people who are least responsible for having produced or used the plastic are the ones who wind up having to deal with the pollution. The countries generating the most plastic waste, which can also be inferred to be the countries in which consumers are demanding the most plastic, include the US, the EU, China, India, and Brazil. But many environmental groups have focused on the countries from which the most marine plastic pollution stems, and those include the Philippines, India, Indonesia, and Malaysia, among other developing nations. So because pollution of any kind doesn't respect geographic boundaries, when we have mismanaged plastic waste or really any kind of packaging waste, that mismanaged waste enters our oceans and winds up in these large gyres, river systems. It often winds up affecting the people who are least equipped to deal with the repercussions, and that tends to be in developing nations. So we see environmental justice issues with plastic pollution just like we do with many other environmental issues.
Are there any specific health impacts that come to mind when we think about current plastic packaging practices?
I mean, we have read the headlines about microplastics being found on every inch of the planet and in every part of our bodies. By 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the sea. There's a dump truck of plastics added to the ocean each minute, and we eat one credit card's worth of plastic each week. All of these numbers give a sense of the scale of what is happening in us and around us. And we are only just now starting to see research on the health impacts of microplastics and the chemicals that they contain and what is happening to humans and animals as a result of ingesting or otherwise being exposed to plastics and microplastics. So it's certainly something we have our eye on as people start plugging into this new world of research and understanding about what the health impacts might be.
I think it's important to remember that plastic, particularly in packaging, has negative health effects across the entire life cycle. So that includes even in the creation of plastic itself. So residents of fence line communities adjacent to places where plastic is being produced, but also places where plastic pollution and waste disposal sites exist, experience risks of premature birth, low birth weight, asthma, childhood leukemia, cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer. During use and in disposal, plastics release a variety of toxic chemicals, many of which include the additives called plasticizers, but there are other additives as well, and those can have serious health effects too.
Thank you both for expanding on those. Finally, what kind of environmental impacts are we seeing linked to the way that we use plastic and packaging in today's world?
Yeah, to Caroline's point, if we think about plastics and the full life cycle of plastics from production through to disposal, the environmental impacts are widespread and quite varied. Everything from climate impacts when we think about virgin plastics as being typically derived from fossil fuels. And so we can tie closely some of the climate impacts to plastic production. And then plastics in the environment have the obvious impacts of affecting natural ecosystems, the animals themselves, but also the functioning of ocean ecosystems or even terrestrial ecosystems as plastics are entering there and everything in between. It's difficult to be specific because it's really throughout the entire life cycle. Plastics are impacting the environment as we know it and changing the way the world works.
A lot of those effects, particularly on marine life, are not super well understood, but almost certainly have huge impacts, especially as they accumulate throughout the supply chain. Small fish that are consuming microplastics being eaten by larger fish, and then seeing this bioaccumulation that eventually affects humans. And while the long-term impacts of plastic consumption on fish in particular is not yet well understood, we do know that these materials can have physical effects like puncturing organs. We also know that some of the toxic chemicals in these plastics can cause long-term disease in fish. That bioaccumulation of the microplastics can be linked with endocrine disruption, decreasing fish populations, and eventually reduced biodiversity. And we can extrapolate a lot of those effects to other species as well. There are estimates that 90% of seabirds have consumed plastic in some way, shape, or form as well. It's important to link the plastic pollution issue with climate change as well. Plastic itself is responsible for, in its production, emitting greenhouse gases. There are estimates that plastic production is responsible for about 3.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the contribution of the entire country of Brazil. Plastic production is carbon intensive. Manufacturing almost anything can be carbon intensive, but 99% of plastic right now comes from fossil fuels. It is coming from these ancient stored carbon sources, and we're making things out of them. And of course, when we do what I think is one of the worst possible disposal mechanisms, incinerating it, we are releasing all of that embodied carbon at once into the atmosphere.
Thank you all for expanding a little bit more on the many impacts linked to the way we use plastic in today's world. So, what does it actually mean to move towards a circular economy? And does this ideal even exist?
So I'll start by talking about what we mean when we say a circular economy. For us, a circular economy is three principles driven by design. And so you're eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products and materials at their highest values, and regenerating nature. We need to do more of all of this and undertake these circular activities to get closer to a circular economy. Does a circular economy ideal exist today? I'm afraid the answer is no, but does that mean it's not worth working towards? No. I think there's a lot of value in working towards these upstream solutions, things like reduction of plastics used and produced, and then also reuse as solutions that we can be looking to in addition to downstream solutions like recycling to get us closer to that circular economy ideal that I think we would all want.
One of the things that I love about the circular economy philosophy is that you can frame it in terms of pure economics. One of the things that I have found helpful in the private sector is to explain circular economy as how do we maintain the value of products for as long as possible How do we keep things at their highest and best use to maintain their economic value? Because the worst case scenario, economically speaking, is throwing something away, because it means that you're throwing away all of the embedded economic value. So we know that there is a waste hierarchy. Ideally, we want to reuse a product for as long as we can, keep it circulating in the economy by passing that item off to another person or business. And then, of course, there are more downstream ways to manage an item's economic value, such as recycling, where you are taking a product and grinding it back up to be turned into yet another product. Maybe you can turn it into the same product, maybe into a different or lower economic value product. That's what we call downcycling. And sometimes in our circular economy, we maintain very small loops per se. For example, if you're recycling a beverage can, there's a pretty high likelihood that that's going to go back into another beverage can. But we also sometimes see very large loops where we're maintaining economic value. Composting is a great example of this, where you're taking the biological nutrients embedded in food or compostable packaging and sending that back to soil that's eventually going to become something else of nutritious value. So I like to think about it as far as how do we maintain the economic value of this product? And part of our big challenge now, looking at what is it going to take to achieve a circular economy, is how do we align the economic incentives to make it as attractive to keep the economic value of a product as it would be to throw something away. Right now, the economic incentive is that it's easier to throw something away than to do something with the parts. And so how do we change the incentives through policy, through economics, to make it unattractive to throw away the entire toaster because one piece has broken?
I think your point about economics is really interesting. The thing you described about when we discard things makes me wonder, doesn't it have negative value actually to the commons where we're all paying for that end of life management and the effects? So is that accounted for, those negative values?
Well, I think that's exactly what policies like extended producer responsibility were trying to address. When we have those negative effects that affect all of us, those are textbook environmental externalities where we're paying for them, but it's not something that any one of us has the incentive to fix. And so how do you create systems in policy that internalize those costs? That's exactly what a lot of environmental policy has to wrangle with.
Thank you all for expanding on that. I think those are really interesting considerations. And moving into talking about international efforts to address plastics and packaging, as we know, there are international efforts to curb plastics waste and packaging waste. And one of those is the International Plastics Treaty. Could one of you briefly explain the current status of this International Plastics Treaty and possibly any major proposals related to packaging?
So in 2022, the United Nations Environment Assembly agreed to a resolution whereby they launched the negotiations towards a plastics treaty, or what we call a legally binding instrument. And we have been working on that ever since. There have been 5 meetings of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, called the INC, over the last couple of years. The next meeting will be this August in Geneva, and it will be INC 5.2, a continuation of the 5th meeting. And this will hopefully be the last negotiating meeting in this process, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The end goal for this process is to end plastic pollution. Since the last meeting, which was last December in Busan, South Korea, negotiators have been working tirelessly in the intersessional period to converge on the key issues that need to be addressed in the treaty to tackle plastic pollution. But how to get there and getting into the technicalities has been really challenging, especially on such a short timeline. The scope of the treaty potentially could be the full life cycle of plastics, and there aren't a lot of specific sector focuses in the draft text that we're working off of right now, but packaging is a priority sector that we expect would be regulated in the near term once the treaty is adopted. The types of regulations that might come out of the treaty that would drive what countries and even more local level governments would be working on are things like product and chemical bans or restrictions, product design requirements. And when I say product design, I'm talking about kind of design for recycling, design for reuse, design for reduction and optimization, those sorts of things. And then also there's been quite a bit of conversation about global target for production or supply, sustainable consumption and production. I mean, certainly there's still a lot being negotiated. And those are the topics that countries care about, but are also really sticky because everyone is bringing a different set of circumstances, different national priorities to the negotiations. But if we're able to land a treaty that covers any of those topics, that should, in theory, drive national action, either mandatory national action or guidance. Hopefully, it would encourage countries to adopt or incorporate the guidance into their national laws.
What are some possible impacts that could come out of this?
Everyone has been working really hard to reach agreement, and there are a number of countries who have put out statements. Recently, we saw the Nice wake-up call for an ambitious treaty, which was published during the UN Oceans Conference in Nice, France, and 95 countries signed on calling for an ambitious treaty covering all of these topics, getting into financing as well. And that's really encouraging to see 95 countries standing up for what they think is necessary to end plastic pollution. The chances for a strong outcome are really uncertain, but one positive outcome from this process has been an elevation of the level of dialogue around these issues. There are a lot of people who have become much more informed and educated throughout this process. So even if a treaty doesn't land at the next negotiating meeting, hopefully there will be some strong lessons learned and progress made at the country level. One of the goals for the treaty is to end plastic pollution, but there is a large group of businesses calling for harmonization of global regulation. So we work with a group called the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty, who are calling for ambitious controls on product design and product and chemical restrictions in order to deliver the certainty and clarity that they need going forward in order to make investments. And then that certainty and clarity, of course, would benefit governments as well as they develop and enforce new regulations.
Thank you for touching a little bit on international efforts to address plastics. I really appreciate that point, Dacie, about dialogue being really an important part to come out of international conversations about plastics, making sure that everyone's aware of the impacts, the current ways that we use plastics, and possible alternatives. So now I want to talk more about approaches to preventing plastic waste. Caroline, I would love to go back and talk about the waste hierarchy, what that is and how it might apply to the life cycle of plastic packaging. Recycling has historically been seen as a promising tool for waste reduction. And I'm curious if the emphasis has shifted away from recycling at all, or if it's still seen as that tool.
That's a great question. And I think when people see packaging waste, the first thing that they think of is, well, why can't we recycle ourselves out of this problem? So let's back up a little bit and talk about the waste hierarchy. The waste hierarchy is kind of like an inverted pyramid where you're going from your most desirable outcome for waste down to your least preferred outcome for waste. Ideally, the first thing you do is you prevent waste from happening to begin with. And there's actually a lot that we can do to prevent packaging waste to begin with, such as using less packaging. So one of the things that consumers may be familiar with is when you receive a package through e-commerce in the mail and you receive a product in a much too large box with a lot of cushioning, and there's this tiny product inside, and you think, why did they have to use such a large box? There has been a large effort in the packaging industry towards what we call right-sizing packaging, which just makes sense, right? And theoretically should be saving companies money as far as how much packaging they're having to use. So yeah, there's a lot we can do to even be preventing packaging waste to begin with. Then there's this big category of reuse. That has received a lot of new interest in the last few years as policy has tried to incentivize packaging reuse. We see lots of models of reuse being piloted all over the world. For example, where you can purchase a container for something like cleaning supplies and then refill your container with a concentrated solution rather than buying a new spray bottle every time. So we're seeing more instances of reuse, especially in food service, where in restaurants, we're going back to a little bit more of a traditional restaurant model where there are washable plates, cutlery, etc., or even systems where you're given something in a reusable container and then return it later. So there are lots of different ways that this whole reuse and refill system can go that prevents packaging waste in the first place. Only then, after we go from reducing and reusing, do we get into the option in our waste hierarchy of recycling. And that's something that a lot of consumers are familiar with, putting something in their curbside bin. Another example of recycling is composting. When people think of recycling, they think of what the MacArthur Foundation very articulately explains as recycling technical materials. So things like paper, plastic, glass, putting those back into new products that are made of paper, plastic, and glass. But we can also recycle biological nutrients by composting and putting those nutrients back into soil. After recycling, we're starting to get into our less desirable option for waste management. And the next one is recover. So when we talk about recovering from waste, what that often refers to is waste to energy. So we can convert waste to energy through incineration, where that heat is used to generate electricity. We see other versions of that, such as capturing methane gas that comes off of landfills that can then be used to make natural gas or to generate electricity on site. And then after recovery, we just have plain old disposal, ideally in a managed landfill setting, meaning a landfill that is designed to have the least amount of environmental impact possible. And of course, what we really don't want to see in that disposal is leakage into the environment. So just to reiterate, in that hierarchy, we're going from preventing waste to begin with, reducing where we can, reuse and refill, recycling, recovery, and then disposal.
In California law, there is a statute that specifically defines what that waste hierarchy is. I think, though, it's unfortunate that we think of it as a pyramid, because if you really think about the very top of it, source reduction, it would be really nice if that first level was reuse, refill, because to tie back to what Caroline talked about earlier, when you collect the whole thing and reuse it, you've kept all of the value that's in that product. So the return in terms of keeping plastic out of the waste stream is way greater than recycling. Often you use a lot more plastic to make something reusable. And that's a whole other problem in some settings. But if you just took it back, you keep all of it in the economy. The challenge really at its core is this stuff is so cheap to make that is it valuable enough to have a reverse logistics system? And that's one of the big challenges in changing the system itself.
Thank you both for explaining these challenges. It's really helpful to understand the different levels of the way we're disposing of our waste, but also rethink the way we're structuring it.
Daniel, could you think of an example that showcases why it's important to emphasize top-level reuse?
I just think it's really worthwhile to hammer home the difficulty of that top level reuse, because we've seen in California what I think was a disaster when we're talking about requiring the bags to be reusable at grocery stores. In theory, all of it's being put back into the economy. But what we saw is instead, to make these bags reusable, you used thicker plastic. And then if the reuse system doesn't work, you've just multiplied the amount of plastic that is being disposed of. And I can't tell you how upsetting it was for me, just as a consumer, to be in a store and see 90% of the customers every time getting all new plastic bags, where the idea was that they were not going to be getting the plastic bags. They were going to be reusing the ones that came before. So you see California law trying to prevent that from happening, but it's a major challenge.
Daniel, I think that's so important, particularly when we talk about reuse, to talk about reuse systems for exactly this reason. We have to think about comprehensive suites of policies that are going to set us up for the systems change that we need, not simply target one product or one material and call that a solution, because that experience in California has been repeated innumerable times around the world where we don't have the systems in place to support the changes that we're calling for. And we are, in fact, kind of stepping further away from our end goal.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. It's so important to think about the possible impacts of different approaches or innovations to curb plastic waste and if those might end up backfiring. So thinking about the ways that people are trying to approach packaging design or reuse systems, are there any promising innovations or approaches being brought forth that have potential?
One example that I always like to bring up in reuse and refill is stadiums and universities. These are more closed environments where it is easier to get people to return whatever the packaging or food service item was. For example, in a stadium, if you're ordering a drink, it makes sense to serve a vessel that can just be returned before you even walk out of the stadium. Generally, people are consuming the item on site. So you can create systems to clean and disinfect and reuse those pieces of packaging on site. So when thinking about reuse and refill, thinking about where are the consumers when they purchase the product, when they use the product, and when they want to be rid of the product, that can be a helpful checklist to figure out, is this a place where it might be easy and effective to institute reuse and refill?
Is recycling changing too, especially when it comes to the way we're recycling, the quality of recycled materials, and just the market demand for them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So recycling is something that consumers rarely see how it actually happens. And so it's easy to miss a lot of the exciting changes that we're seeing, first and foremost in sortation technology. Generally, when you put something in your curbside bin, the first place it goes is a material recovery facility, MRF. Usually in the industry, we call that a MRF. And at a MRF, the first thing they do, especially in the US where we have single stream recycling, is separate all of the different materials into different bales that are then each sold to reprocessors to turn them into new products. So the first place that we're seeing a lot of interesting innovation is in that sortation. It's surprising to a lot of people that a lot of that sortation still happens very manually in a lot of places. You have people on more or less a conveyor belt sorting things out or using pretty basic processes like magnets to take out ferrous metals. We've seen some interesting developments in near infrared technology and what we call optical sorters that can sort different types of plastic. So that's the other thing. You can't just recycle all plastic together. I like to make the analogy to cheese, where different kinds of plastic are like different kinds of cheese. If you had a bunch of leftover cheese of different types from a party, you would not want to melt all that cheese together and try to turn it into new cheese. You need to separate them into the different kinds of cheese so that if you wanted to melt it down and turn them into new blocks of cheese, one would be cheddar, one would be brie, one would be Gouda, etc. And that's what we have to do with plastic. And that's part of the reason plastic is so complicated, is there are so many different types. So with near infrared and optical sortation in our facilities, we can now do a better job separating different kinds of plastic from each other, which creates cleaner bales, which create higher value products for MRFs to be able to sell to reprocessors, which create better products that those reprocessors can sell back into the market. So those are just some of the really exciting things that we're seeing in MRFs. And I would encourage any of your listeners, if you ever have a chance to tour a MRF, absolutely do it. It is so enlightening. Different MRFs can be very different from each other. Some of them have much higher end technologies. And I'm hopeful that over the next 5-10 years, especially with additional investments thanks to policy, we will see more upgraded MRFs.
Has that technology been accelerating in recent years?
I'm very optimistic about the role that AI and other technologies can play in this sortation. When I've been to some of the more upgraded MRFs that have optical sorters, many of which use AI to pick different kinds of plastic out from the conveyor belt, it is going so fast that you can't even really tell what's happening. And the tour guide said, what you want to do is take a video of what you're seeing in slow motion on your phone, because you'll see that, for example, the first optical sorter is there to pick out PET, which is the plastic that has the #1 resin code that you see on the bottom of things like soda bottles. All of this waste is flowing along on this conveyor belt, and the optical sorter identifies using AI which of these plastics is made specifically of PET, and then it blows a shot of air at that particular material, which throws it over a barrier so that it's only collecting PET. Everything else goes through the next optical sorter. And they'll pick out maybe your #2 plastics, your high density polyethylene. That optical sorter will specifically look for those. So we're not seeing this in all of our MRFs yet. I'm really excited for when we get to a point that we do, but I'm very optimistic that things like AI can help improve the efficiency of this sortation and make it more economical for MRFs.
Can I chime in with one thought here on the kind of improvements to recycling and the opportunities presented by AI? I think we are seeing major companies like Google piloting some of this. And one of the exciting aspects of it is also the potential that these improvements in recycling technology have to deliver value to the people who are bringing the recycling. And so as we think about who is picking up the waste, often there are informal sector folks, right, like waste pickers in these countries that are collecting waste and bringing them to the facilities. And when you're able to have improved technology to understand what the products are and what the value is, then in theory, you can be compensating people for what they're bringing in, which is a really exciting opportunity that we have as technology improves and as we get to better understand what these flows are and where they're coming from.
Thanks for adding that, everyone. Caroline, one reason I was so intrigued by Atlantic Packaging is because it's the largest privately held packaging company in North America. And it's also the first packaging company in North America to set a net zero science-based target through the Science Based Targets Initiative and achieve an A score from the Carbon Disclosure Project. So, as the directors of sustainability at a company who is really leading in this space, what do you think the role of the private sector could be in this?
One complaint we hear from consumers is that they want to buy more sustainable products or products packaged more sustainably, but they don't feel like they have a choice. If you walk into a grocery store today, it is almost impossible to do your shopping without buying a lot of single-use plastic. And this is similar to things that we hear from consumers about wanting to make an impact on their carbon footprint by buying more renewable electricity. Short of putting solar panels on your house, you as a consumer, as a citizen, as a taxpayer, only have so much control over what kind of energy is being delivered to your home. It's your utility that ends up making that decision. So when we talk about the role of the private sector in addressing packaging waste, I think that it is our job, the consumer packaged goods and brands' jobs, to be offering consumers more choice of sustainable products so that when you go to the grocery store and you're looking on the shelf, you actually have a choice for a more sustainable or sustainably packaged product. This, of course, is easier said than done because sometimes that comes at a higher cost. And to be honest, even though consumer surveys show that consumers say that they're willing to pay a slight premium for sustainable products, it isn't really borne out in the actual purchase data. We find that sustainably packaged products are a tiebreaker. So if two products are the same price, a consumer is more likely to buy the sustainably packaged product. But if it's more than, say, 10% premium, we don't really see that purchasing behavior come from consumers. So that means that the onus here on the private sector is pretty large. We need to figure out how to provide sustainable and sustainably packaged products at pretty much near price parity to the products that consumers are used to buying. A really great example is chips. When you buy potato chips, you would be amazed at how highly engineered a chip bag actually is to maintain freshness and to keep that bag of chips shelf stable for often years at a time. When we're trying to figure out how to package that in a more recyclable format, that's not something we can do overnight. I'm optimistic about the momentum from packaging manufacturers and material scientists around designing better packaging, but this is a long-term project. It's the packaging companies and manufacturers' responsibility to be doing a lot of that research and development. So we have to go way upstream in terms of responsibility for solving this problem. And a lot of it winds up coming down to designing better materials. And then from a business point of view, figuring out how to make those products economically viable at a mass scale.
Thanks so much for explaining that, Caroline. I think it's
It's super helpful to think about all the different ways in which the private sector can participate in reducing packaging waste.
so. Now I want to dive into extended producer responsibility, or EPR laws, and the potential they have for promoting a more circular economy. Can one of you give us an explanation? What is extended producer responsibility and what makes it a powerful policy tool?
I think this is a good place for me to hop in first. The concept behind extended producer responsibility is to require those who produce material to take responsibility for what happens to them at the end of their lives. In California, we have multiple examples of this already: carpet, paint, mattresses, batteries, pharmaceutical sharps. Soon, there'll also be a program for textiles. The idea being, if you have certain roles in the supply chain, you might be responsible for it. And you have to make sure that it's managed in certain ways, that some amount of it is recycled, how it's disposed of, making sure there's opportunities in the infrastructure for things to be recovered. So it's appealing because it's easier to do this rather than taxing the heck out of something and funding a government program to handle it all. And we mentioned classic environmental externalities before. This is one way to mitigate the externalities, focus on the market and make sure the producers internalize those costs. They have to pay for the infrastructure needed to keep things out of landfills. We use the word producers to refer in general to whoever's responsible. The producers, they have to make sure the materials they use can be managed by the infrastructure. In the new SB 54 law, there's also an environmental mitigation fund. The funding comes from the producers, and a lot of that cost is going to be borne ultimately by the consumer. But that fund makes sure that there is mitigation activity happening to lessen those environmental effects. And I will say the challenge we have for packaging is just fundamentally different than a huge roll of carpet, paint cans, mattresses, batteries, sharps. Those are specific, easily identified products, whereas packaging, it's not specific. It's connected to everything, all commercial goods, including the ones for which there's already EPR programs. And then the other big challenge is just how cheap it is to make plastics. How do you have value at the end of the material's life? And how do you make sure that the bales of the stuff at their end of life have an end market? We use the term end market to refer to where in the supply chain or in the waste stream, the materials can be captured and made into new products or redelivered into the supply chain. The law can only do so much to make sure that happens. And it is challenging for plastic packaging as opposed to mattresses. The mattress program has been a good example of an EPR program succeeding. In California, we do recycle a great deal of the mattresses. You don't see mattresses dumped on the street nearly as much as you did 20 years ago.
I think another helpful way of summarizing EPR is by basically calling it a polluter pays law for whatever the product in question is. In this case, we're talking about EPR for packaging. Right now, the producer, the company whose brand appears on the packaging, doesn't have any incentive to design a package that is reusable or easily recyclable. They don't pay any of the costs of managing the waste from their product. So there's no incentive to improve it. But what if you could create a system where that brand was responsible for the end of life costs? And that's where EPR comes in. EPR creates the system where we put the onus on the producers. And when we say the producer, we generally mean the brand whose logo appears on the piece of packaging. We make them responsible either operationally or financially for the end of life management of that product. The kind of key way that EPR winds up looking is that you charge the producers fees based on the amount and type of packaging that they sell into whatever the regulated economy is. So they would pay some number of cents per pound for every pound of corrugated cardboard that they sell as packaged goods into that state, and a different amount for the plastic film and every kind of packaging that you can think of that's a covered material under that law. And using those different fees, you will have higher fees for materials that are more difficult to dispose of. That creates upstream incentives for brands to be using packaging that is more reusable, recyclable, or compostable, depending on the state. But of course, the first thing it does is it incentivizes brands to use less packaging to begin with. So if I'm a brand and I'm being charged some number of cents per pound for every piece of packaging that I'm selling into that state, you better bet that I'm not trying to use more packaging than I have to. We like it from the waste hierarchy perspective because the first thing it does is it incentivizes prevention of packaging waste to begin with. And each state that has implemented or is in the process of implementing EPR has a variety of other characteristics to incentivize things like reuse and refill, maybe compostability. But so those fees are collected and used to either reimburse the municipalities and the taxpayers for the costs of disposal so that the costs are not borne onto the citizenry alone. And sometimes those fees are also used to reinvest in better recycling infrastructure general collection infrastructure. So in our economic terminology, it is a very elegant way to internalize the environmental externalities of packaging waste.
I want to add some of the legal nuance to the concept as well. I know a lot of our audience is in the legal field. So what Caroline described is an idealized discussion of what EPR programs are. When we talk about holding the brand responsible, you run into legal problems because ideally you would marry the ideals of EPR with a state's ability to enforce it. One of the huge legal challenges is we want the brand to be linked to the responsibility, but what if a state either doesn't have the bandwidth or the legal ability to enforce a law against the brand? Maybe the brand is overseas and a fly-by-night company that just made up a brand and sold it on an e-commerce platform. What if it's an IP holding company that is located somewhere outside the state and we have legal obstacles to enforcing against them? Often we are left with having to say, well, you physically operated the company that brought it physically into the state. And that's all we can do to hold somebody responsible. And you start getting farther from that brand owner ideal. So legally in drafting statutes, that's where we run into challenges making that ideal a reality. I think an even bigger challenge is, what is recycling to begin with? When does recycling end and disposal begin? And then when did recycling happen? Everybody understands in general the process of recycling. It's taking something that got discarded or became waste and making it not waste. But when did it become recycled? And so that's one of the huge challenges in public comments that have been made on the SB 54 regulations that are still pending. The questions of what is recycling, whether chemical recycling is recycling or manufacturing, those questions are still to be decided, and we're working through them in California.
One additional challenge from the producer side around compliance with extended producer responsibility. We're seeing it pop up in a number of jurisdictions within the US and around the world. Producers are in a position where they're having to answer those questions Daniel is raising in every jurisdiction where they operate that is having extended producer responsibility laws adopted, which makes it incredibly difficult. There's a huge compliance burden there that we see folks really struggling with, which is part of why people are advocating to have extended producer responsibility somehow incorporated in a global treaty, or considering what it could look like at a federal level to just get some general direction so that there's some consistency and harmonization to lessen the compliance burden. And when some of these hard challenges are solved, to hopefully mean that they don't have to be solved 1,800 times in every different city or state that has a law.
Also, I think the elephant in the room is the consumer. We can have all the laws we want, but at some point, the consumer is taking control of the packaging. They put it in the trash, but consumers, their behavior is going to change. Whether the law can stimulate that change or not is very much unknown. It's a big experiment, really. Can consumers be inspired to change their behavior? I mentioned earlier the problem I refer to as the plastic bag problem. It's when you say this is reusable and consumers just say, it's not, I'm just going to get new ones. In the SB 54 context, there are very powerful provisions in the statute saying you can't say this is reusable unless you meet very burdensome requirements about the infrastructure that's available. But even so, that only goes so far. You can regulate the behavior of the producers that are taking back material and make sure that infrastructure is working. But what about the materials that consumers reuse themselves? And how do you hold the producer responsible? How do you penalize them if they did everything they can, but it just didn't have the results they wanted? It's a huge compliance challenge. It's a huge enforcement challenge.
These are all such good points. And the explanation of EPR that I gave earlier was definitely idealized for what it is that we're trying to do. As you can tell from this conversation, putting it into practice is really hard, especially speaking from a US context where we have all of these states doing slightly different things in terms of their EPR laws, but also doing slightly different things in terms of other laws they may have on the books as well. For example, we see laws or proposed pieces of legislation around minimum recycled content amounts, around forever chemicals, around things like truth in labeling. That is to say, what kinds of packaging products can be labeled as recyclable. All of these laws are necessarily interacting with each other, and that can make it very difficult to design a really good law. And even if you're designing a good system in your own state where all of your laws are complementing each other, that doesn't mean that they're going to complement those of other states. So to Dacie's point earlier, hopefully we start to see harmonization among the states to do the thing that generally works the best.
And can we chat a little bit about California's specific EPR law? What are some current features of California's law intended to ensure that these goals are met? But also, how could an EPR law go further than California's?
So, as we were explaining, the fundamental aspect of EPR are these fees that you wind up charging producers for the cost of disposal of their product. In all of these different EPR laws in different states, even if that's the fundamental policy mechanism, we see different states adding what I call Christmas ornaments to the Christmas tree that is EPR. And one of the big ones in California are the requirements that all packaging be recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2032. So that in and of itself is not an EPR framework. It's just a mandate that was added and is very important to this law, SB 54. EPR on its own doesn't necessarily ban any given packaging product from being put in the marketplace. But when you start adding in things like that provision that all packaging be recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2032, there are other incentives to start moving away from very difficult to recycle materials. So that's one of the hallmark pieces of SB 54 that makes it different from some of the other EPR laws we see in other states.
Yeah, the other features of SB 54 include a recycling rate requirement, specifically for plastic, what we call cover material. There are 3 targets for achieving recycling rates, which is the amount of material that's recycled out of the total amount of material. By 2028, it has to be 30%. By 2030, it has to be 40%. And by 2032, it has to be 65%. The other huge feature of SB 54 is source reduction requirement, which is the top level of the waste hierarchy that we talked about earlier. Under SB 54, producers have to achieve a 25% reduction compared to the amount of plastic covered material produced in 2023. By 2032, there are some interim goals and some components of source reduction, what percentage of it you can achieve through elimination or right sizing. And those are fairly prescriptive, but they are powerful because you either meet them or you don't. And if you don't, you are subject to penalties and additional requirements might be placed on you to make sure that ultimately those targets are met. One of the issues that is top of mind is the funding mechanisms for local jurisdictions and their contracted recycling service providers. The producers are going to be responsible for making sure that any of the added costs that the law places on the local jurisdictions or their providers for handling these materials, that the organization that administers the program covers those costs. Another key feature of SB 54 is trying to solve or avoid the problem of things being called reusable, but then not being reused. And we saw this in California regarding the law that was requiring plastic bags in grocery stores to be reusable. So in SB 54, there are some pretty rigorous requirements for what can be called reusable, and they're attempting to enable and account for consumer behavior. There has to be convenience elements met. You have to have infrastructure that can actually be used. You have to market and design your materials to be reused. And the actual requirement for infrastructure mitigates that problem that we had with the plastic bags. Another key part is that it has built-in mechanisms to allow CalRecycle as the regulator to adopt pragmatic approaches to the problems that inevitably are going to arise. Statute didn't try to anticipate every single problem that producers are going to face for meeting the really ambitious goals of the law. But the statute affords CalRecycle multiple avenues to exercise discretion. For example, there are provisions for exempting materials where there are special difficulties for compliance. CalRecycle can look at a situation and say, this material is going to be impossible to comply. That doesn't need to be compostable or recyclable. And that's only going to happen in unique circumstances where there are compelling reasons not to transition to other materials. There's also a way CalRecycle can say, yes, we're exempting you, but we see ways that this can be rectified. So we're going to phase you into the program and create a plan for you to become recyclable or compostable. There's also a process in the law for allowing violators up to 2 years where you're going to do certain things. We know compliance is possible at some point at the end of this process, and you're going to avoid penalties altogether. And the other way that flexibility is just inherent in the law is CalRecycle gets to decide how materials are characterized and categorized. That's important because Most of the requirements themselves are going to be assessed on that category basis. So how CalRecycle does that categorization can influence or affect how compliance ultimately happens. And a lot of these features mean that the law is open-ended, and that open-endedness has caused some understandable consternation that has been expressed in public. But I'm confident it will ultimately pay dividends because CalRecycle does have some levers to pull to make sure the program succeeds. So I think those are the key high-level features. And I'll just jump into how EPR laws can go farther. Just speaking as a consumer, I really was horrified by the plastic bag problem. We won't know for some time whether California's law is sufficient, but I can see ways that law could go farther. It could impose really strict requirements with regard to actual reuse when consumers need to be the ones doing the deed. There are requirements in the statute where if the producer is the one managing a reuse system, there has to be actual multiple reuses, but the law doesn't actually do that for the types of materials that are going to be reused by the consumer. So the container that consumers are just going to be expected to refill. Well, what if they don't do that? The law could, in theory, impose actual performance requirements. It would be challenging to monitor those, but I think humankind has solved more difficult problems than that. And if it isn't happening, then maybe the law needs to require the producers to transition to taking back the materials and having a producer take back requirement. Maybe the materials need to be compostable or recyclable at their end of life. If you're going to call this reusable and it's not being reused, there has to be sortation in place to make sure it's taken out of the garbage and reused or recycled after that. That's just the kind of infrastructure that the statute contemplated existing. Maybe you incentivize coordination with existing take-back programs. Maybe you require a warranty be used for anything that's reusable or refillable. If you call something reusable and consumers get it and then it falls apart, well, it's not going to be reused. And it's very hard for regulators to make sure that that's not happening. The second idea that I think could be really powerful is addressing better the problem with e-commerce platforms. The operator of the platform isn't necessarily the one selling the material and the goods. It's third parties. There's a system set up where you can access the platform and sell your own wares. Well, what happens when those goods are packaged unlawfully? They could flood the market in California, but the state might have no ability to police those sellers who would be, in most instances, the producer. And this is a huge issue. Just think about the volume as a consumer you order from an online seller. It's so convenient. How do we make sure they comply? One idea is doing something like what we do under federal copyright law. If you're operating a platform where people are infringing someone's rights, they're posting content that is unlawful because it violates a copyright. If somebody reports that, the platform operator has to have a system for taking it down. I can imagine the same system essentially existing for e-commerce platforms. If CalRecycle says you need to take them off your platform until they're compliant, that would be such a powerful lever to have. And I think it's going to be a significant problem in the law as it exists today.
Dacie, when we're talking about state to state, I know in your work you're dealing with a lot of policy across North America. Are you seeing any of these challenges play out?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, over the years, I think that this theme of a need for harmonization, a patchwork of regulations, like this comes up repeatedly in a lot of areas of environmental law, but EPR is a really good example of that, where it's just a huge compliance burden to manage across all of the jurisdictions. And I would say, even looking outside the US, it's not only a compliance burden for the regulated entities, but for the regulators, it's an administrative burden to kind of reinvent the wheel every time without this standardized approach. So folks are looking for harmonization at the federal level and at the global level when it comes to EPR and other policies. This point has been made a few times, but SB 54 is so much more than an EPR law. When we think about the need for a suite of policies to make an EPR law as effective as it can be, we see California starting to pull those pieces together in SB 54. We see that less elsewhere, which leads to this different patchwork across states about what folks can expect or understand from the regulatory landscape.
You mentioned a few things that remind me of some important issues that arise in 54. What is the burden? It's not just financial. Being responsible means not only the funding, you have to track this information and you have to provide that information to, say, CalRecycle, an agency in Oregon, whatever it is. And as these things proliferate, what are you going to have 50 different reporting requirements? So some harmonization long term might just have to happen. And hopefully states, as these things grow, do what they can to make that less burdensome. I have low confidence that the federal government is going to do something in this area. But one big problem with federal law is it is a barrier in some ways. Various types of products need to comply with federal laws. It would be great if those federal laws were not more restrictive than they needed to be, or can clarify where there might be flexibility to accommodate the needs for compostability, recyclability, or reusability. Another area I think is worth mentioning where the California EPR program is leading the way, I think, is with respect to what is compostable or recyclable. In California, it's directly tied to how you can label your products. The EPR program doesn't care how you label your product. You can lie, do whatever you want. You're not violating the EPR program. But to be recyclable, you have to meet the same standards for lawfully being labeled recyclable. To be compostable under the EPR law, you have to meet all the requirements for lawfully being labeled compostable. So there are opportunities to leverage these concepts. And to the extent all of these things can be harmonized across states, it would really benefit everybody. But I like the consistency that happens when the recyclable labeling laws are the same as the EPR laws.
Daniel, you're very hopeful to think federal law could solve some of this, but I think even federal guidance, right? Something that was proposed under EPA circular economy strategy for plastics was federal guidance on EPR for packaging, which would be super helpful. It doesn't even have to go so far as to be binding, but to give some sense of direction, I think would be hugely beneficial here. And again, same is true at the global level, right? Because a lot of these companies that are major brands are producing products across borders. And so they're covering this in the US. And I don't think this is true for packaging, but for other EPR programs, it is really at the city and county level before it's at the state level sometimes. Thinking of cities and counties and states and countries around the world, it gets a bit overwhelming.
When we're thinking of other places where there have been interesting innovations, are there any other states or countries that are getting it right or doing something that does make you hopeful?
I don't think we even know what's going to work yet. I think this is still so new with packaging. There's this old trope in the law that states are laboratories of democracy. Maybe it's useful that there are multiple states, and what programs might work is more than one.
I've heard anecdotally some successes in various countries like Italy for how the packaging EPR program has worked, but it's very hard to draw conclusions from those because these countries are just so different than we are. The recycling infrastructure is different. Part of the problem with waste in the US is we're just a really big country. And that means that trucking waste from one place to another is not very economically viable. We end up treating it differently than other countries do. And we also see some differences in other existing laws that can have an impact on how successful EPR is. Listeners of the podcast may be familiar with deposit return systems or bottle bills where you receive a refund for returning a beverage container like a soda bottle or an aluminum can. And oftentimes the way that deposit return systems end up interacting with EPR can affect the success of EPR. And we often see that happening in Canadian provinces as well as in the EU. So there are just so many variables that can affect how EPR is laid out. And that can sometimes give us lessons about what might be successful and what's not. But so far, it appears that the American design of packaging EPR for various states is really quite different than what we've seen in Canada and the EU.
Thank you all for expanding a little bit more on EPR and the possible impacts that it can have in dealing with plastic packaging issues. So, to bring everything back to the bigger picture, let's talk about the role that all these different tools can play. How can we expect the plastics market to react to increasing compliance measures from around the world, as well as other economic pressures?
There's a kind of awkward thing happening among creators and users of plastic packaging, and that has to do with downgauging and using less packaging. For a long time, what we saw was a movement away from heavier and more structural kinds of packaging in favor of flexible plastic films because they use a lot less plastic. Instead of using a cardboard box to send e-commerce shipment, there was a desire to use plastic mailing envelopes, which we generally call mailers in the industry. They use less material, generally speaking, and they weigh less, which can help with the carbon footprint. So for a long time, we've actually been witnessing a movement towards flexible plastic films as the most efficient way to use packaging. That's part of the reason why in the grocery store, you see a lot more things packaged in flexible plastic pouches or bags rather than in metal cans, glass, or even sometimes in paper. So although that is theoretically a very efficient use of plastic, we know that those flexible plastics are really hard to recycle. So the EPR programs have a choice to make here, but given that plastic films are so thin and so lightweight, the fees on them are going to need to be relatively high to start disincentivizing their use if what we want to optimize for is more recyclable materials. And there has to be a conscious choice made here. I'd say generally speaking, in EPR for packaging in the US, that is what we're seeing, is we want to move away from difficult to recycle materials. So even though the plastics industry has been leaning in to plastic films for probably the better part of 20 years now, are we going to start to see movement away from those towards cartons, towards boxes, towards tins? And then as environmentalists, we need to think about what are the environmental trade-offs that come with doing that. It is more energy intensive to make an aluminum can than it is to make a similar structure made of plastic. And are we okay with that? We're going to have to decide that. The plastics industry and manufacturers of packaged goods are going to need to make some pretty big decisions here about the kinds of packaging formats that make sense to use within the incentive structure of EPR.
This has been so informative. Any final thoughts from any of you?
When we think about the growth and compliance measures, there's an assumption that folks will shy away from that. But in practice, I think that can actually be really good for businesses and for everyone else. We can all benefit from these compliance measures. If we think about product design requirements that are going to make products more easily recycled or reused through standardized packaging for reuse, these measures can actually drive value for businesses by giving them some certainty to make the investments they need to make. And so I worry when we start thinking about compliance measures and new regulations having this negative tone, when in practice, I think it can be really beneficial.
I just wanted to make a comment. I love having conversations with folks like you who are more in the solutions business and can talk about what's going to happen as opposed to being the lawyers. It's just poking legal holes and everything and talking about how things might not work. I just very much appreciate the learning experience and the dialogue.
It's so helpful to have cross-sector conversations here. What I'll say to wrap up is I'm really excited about a lot of the packaging innovation that we're seeing coming and a lot of the changes that I'm already seeing our customers, big brands, starting to make at the behest of EPR. They see policy coming, and that can help even the playing field for folks. It can really propel some of that innovation or action that maybe businesses had been thinking about but hadn't really pushed over the edge. And on the packaging side, I work with a lot of really amazing engineers and material scientists. And one of the things that's so fascinating is that for packaging solutions, sometimes what we see are really cool inventions of plastics that are made of things that you never would have guessed before. And then sometimes what we see is a reversion towards packaging materials that we used to use and don't really use anymore, and are finding that actually this thing was pretty good. It's interesting to be in this place of looking both backward and forward of what does the future of packaging look like to address the waste crisis.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you to all three of you for such an enlightening and great discussion. I know our listeners are really going to appreciate diving into the global plastic packaging market and learning more about the possible solutions that we can develop to reduce our footprint and really make sure that we're getting all the value we can out of our plastic goods. So with that, I just want to thank you three for being on People, Places, Planet, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Thanks, Dara. It was great chatting with you all.
Thanks, Dara. It was really an honor to take part in this panel.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.